Chapter 5 Lenin, the Duma, and a mystic named Rasputin, 1905 to 1907. Repression and pogroms. On the very day the October Manifesto was proclaimed, a crowd of jubilant Moscow workers marched to the city jail. There, on this sunny autumn day, filled with so much promise, they eagerly exercised their newly granted freedom of speech by peacefully demonstrating for the immediate release of all political prisoners. They sang hymns, they made speeches, and to their astonishment, the jail doors opened. 140 political prisoners, imprisoned for having spoken and written against the Tsar, now stepped out onto the cobbled street. Roaring its approval, the crowd hoisted several of the released men high onto its shoulders. Triumphantly, they headed back toward the city's center. But they had not gone far before they met a large mob waving patriotic banners and carrying portraits of the Tsar. As the still celebrating workers grew closer, the mob pulled out knives and brass knuckles. Within minutes, the workers' triumph turned to terror as they were slashed and beaten. Some were forced to kneel before Nicholas's portrait, while others were made to kiss the national flag. When the attack was over, one of the prisoners lay dead, and dozens more were wounded. Who had committed this crime? The Union of Russian People, later to be known as the Black Hundred. Staunch supporters of the Tsar, members of the Black Hundred, vowed to stamp out anyone they believed threatened the autocracy. This included upstart workers, students, and Jews, most especially Jews. Formed in early October, the Black Hundred's membership swelled with uprooted peasants forced into towns as casual laborers, small shopkeepers squeezed by big business, and low-ranking government officials who felt their jobs were threatened by the new reforms. By 1906, the group claimed 300,000 members and 1,000 branches across the country. Nicholas himself proudly wore the group's emblem and accepted one for his infant son, Alexei. Wishing the group total success in uniting loyal Russians, Nicholas helped by financing the group's rabidly anti-Jewish, anti-worker newspaper. He even secretly provided guns to its members. Meanwhile, policemen, acting under orders from Nicholas's Minister of the Interior, encouraged the Black Hundred to take to the streets, turning a blind eye as the mob attacked anyone who looked anti-Tsar. But the group's most vicious attacks were perpetuated against the Jews. In the 2 weeks after the signing of the October Manifesto, there were 694 separate pogroms across the country. Pogroms, derived from the Russian word meaning to wreak havoc, were organized attacks against Jews. And while Nicholas did not instigate these attacks, he did little to discourage them. With staggering brutality, Russian subjects provoked by the Black Hundred rose up against their Jewish neighbors, burning homes, looting shops and synagogues, and murdering innocent men, women, and children. For the most part, police and government officials looked the other way. They took no action to stop the violence or arrest the attackers. Instead, they shared Nicholas's view that the Yids, as he derisively called the Jewish subjects, must be kept in their place. Pogroms were hardly new to Russia. Attacks on Jews had been happening for centuries. One of the worst had occurred just 2 years earlier in the town of Kishinev. Incited by a leaflet printed under the supervision of Nicholas's Minister of the Interior and paid for with the Tsar's money, that read in part, "Brothers, in the name of our Savior, who gave his blood for us, in the name of our very pious little father, the Tsar, let us join on Easter Day in the cry, 'Down with the Jews! Let us massacre these monsters.'" Christians rioted for 3 days. When peace was finally restored, 57 Jews, including 2 babies and a 12-year-old boy, lay dead, and 500 more were wounded. Homes and businesses, 1,400 in all, had been pillaged and destroyed, leaving almost 2,000 Jewish families with little more than rubble. When Nicholas heard what had happened, he was pleased. "Good," he said. "The Jews needed to be taught a lesson." Considered undesirable subjects, Jews had not only been the victims of dozens of pogroms, they'd been subjected to endless imperial decrees meant to discriminate against them. By the time Nicholas took the throne, his predecessors had already created more than 1,400 laws meant to limit the way Jews lived. Among them was a law enforcing almost all Russian Jews, some 5.2 million, or nearly half of all Jews in the world, to live within 15 western provinces known collectively as the Pale of Settlement. Additionally, Jews were forbidden from owning land, serving as army officers, holding a bureaucratic job, or practicing law. They were subject to special and steep taxes on their businesses, on kosher meat, and on synagogues. There were even strict quotas limiting Jewish admittance to high schools and universities. Nicholas himself decreed that those same quotas be applied to grammar schools. Because of this action, 1/3 of all Jewish children aged 12 and under were forbidden from going to school. Nicholas, who believed the world's Jews were conspiring against him, thoroughly approved of these restrictions. By 1906, he also believed the uprising that had led to the October Manifesto had been entirely their fault. They have been putting on airs and leading the revolutionary movement, he claimed. While many Jews did join the ranks of revolutionaries, most were moderates who wanted to make changes through the Duma. Wrote Nicholas to his mother in November 1905, "In the first days after the manifesto, the subversive elements raised their head, and because 9/10 of the troublemakers were Jews, the people's anger turned against them. That's how the pogrom happened. It is amazing how they took place simultaneously in all the towns of Russia and Siberia. It shows clearly what an infuriated mob can do. They surrounded the houses where revolutionaries had taken refuge, set fire to them, and killed everybody trying to escape." Alexandra agreed with her husband. "It's the Jews," she said. "They have filled the people's ears with bad ideas." Beyond the palace gates, house number 13. It began on Easter Sunday, April 19, 1903, just after church let out in the Ukrainian town of Kishinev, shouting, "Down with the Jews! Kill the Christ killers!" Mobs of weapon-wielding, vodka-swilling Christians attacked the 4th District, the section of town where the Jews lived. 8 weeks later, journalist and author Vladimir Korolenko arrived in Kishinev. His goal, he explained, was to pick one episode from the impersonal chaos known as massacre, so the world would know what happened there. He focused on one Jewish dwelling, which he called House Number 13. This is what he reported. About 10 in the morning, a policeman, a man well known in the neighborhood, strongly advised Jewish residents to hide themselves in their houses and not to go out in the streets. The Jews naturally followed this advice, and they barred up the doors, gates, and shutters. The crowd arrived about 11 o'clock, accompanied by 2 patrols of soldiers, who unfortunately had no orders to intervene during the pogrom and remained in the 2 by-streets above and below the doomed house. The rioters consisted of about 50 or 60 persons, among whom it was easy to recognize some of their good neighbors. The rioters set to work with the wholesale destruction of everything that came to hand, and in a few minutes the town square was littered with fragments of glass and furniture and with down and feathers. It soon became apparent, however, that the climax of horror was to center around house number 13. To the left of the gate stand some low-roofed outhouses. In one of these, the glazier Grinsbaum hid with his wife, 2 children, Ita Paskar, wife of the shop assistant Gofsha Paskar, and her 2 children, and a servant girl. The door would not close on the inside, and the structure itself was no stronger than a cardboard box. The rioters rushed for the shed. A neighbor was the first to stab the glazier in the neck. The unhappy man rushed out, but they seized him and dragged him on to the roof of the outhouse, where they finished him off with sticks and clubs. Some of the other Jews made a rush for the attic. Draper's assistant, Berlatsky, who lived in the house with his wife and 4 children, ran up first with his daughter. He was followed by the landlord, Moses Macklin, but the murderers were not long in following the fugitives into the loft. The luckless fugitives realized that it was impossible to hide themselves effectively in the close and stifling attic. Hearing behind them the cries of their pursuers, they began to pull down the roof. Moses Macklin was the first to get out. Berlatsky had first to help his daughter, Chaya, and as he was attempting to follow her, one of his pursuers reached the loft and seized him by the legs. The daughter was attempting to drag her father up, and the pursuer was pulling him backward. But Chaya suddenly ceased her efforts and implored the ruffian to let go of her father. He yielded to her entreaties. The three crouched for some time on the roof of that house. Then the murderers emerged. The Jews began to run around the roof. The rioters followed at their heels. The same neighbor who struck the glazier was the first to wound Berlatsky. Finally, all three were tripped over the edge of the roof. Chaya fell on a pile of feathers and escaped with her life. The wounded Macklin and Berlatsky lay writhing with broken limbs on the pavement, where the cowardly crowd finished them off with crowbars. Ninensin, an accountant, was the last to be killed. He and his wife had hidden in the cellar, but he ran out into the street when he heard the cries of the murdered. This drew the attention of the mob to himself. He was caught and wounded, his legs and arms broken in several places. Then once more the same man who had first wounded Greinspan and Berlatsky stepped forward and struck Ninensin a blow on the head with a crowbar, which put an end to his sufferings. On the same day the news spread that the order had at last come. It took but an hour and a half to restore peace in the town. No blood had to be shed, nor a rifle fired. A show of firmness was all that was necessary. The threat of communism. Meanwhile, the true revolutionaries, a handful of men and women who believed only a violent overthrow of the Tsar could save Russia, still hoped to stage an armed insurrection. Most of them followed the teachings of the 19th century German thinker Karl Marx. Marx saw all of history as a struggle between workers and property owners. That struggle, he believed, would end only when the people owned all natural resources, farms, forests, mineral deposits, as well as banks, railroads, utilities, and factories. Exactly how this commonly owned property would be organized was not addressed. Still, the goal was that everyone be equal. Because of this shared ownership, Marx called his new system communism, and it would come about, he theorized, only after total revolution by the working class. Russian followers of Marx had been working toward this total revolution for almost 30 years, calling themselves by the peaceful-sounding name Social Democrats, or SDs. They were, in fact, a radical group of communists who had done most of their work out of the country. Seen as a threat to the autocracy, SD party leaders had been forced by the Tsar's police to flee Russia. In 1880, they had set up their party headquarters in Switzerland. From there, they published anti-Tsarist pamphlets and newspapers that were smuggled into St. Petersburg and other cities. Their goal was to spread communist ideas to workers as well as to the intelligentsia, academics, and college students. One Russian who seized upon this dream was a short, stocky lawyer named Vladimir Ulyanov. Revolutionary. Vladimir Ulyanov came from the very background he later claimed to scorn. His father was inspector of schools for Simbursk province, a bureaucratic job of the first rank, entitling him to be addressed as Your Excellency. His mother was a member of a land-owning noble family. Born in 1870, little Vladimir was a difficult child. He told lies, cheated at games, and had a mean streak. But he was also smart and an outstanding student. Excellent in everything, he would shout when he brought home his grades. In 1887, Vladimir's older brother, Alexander, was arrested with 72 other university students for plotting to kill Tsar Alexander III, Nicholas's father. As one of the group's leaders, Alexander Ulyanov was hanged. No one knows how this affected 17-year-old Vladimir. Most historians believe it spurred him to join the revolutionary movement, although he never admitted as much publicly. That same year, he graduated from high school at the top of his class without any outward signs of distress. In the fall of 1887, he entered Kazan University, but within weeks, he was expelled for taking part in a small student demonstration. For the next 5 years, he lived on his mother's family estate, earning his law degree from home while also studying the works of Karl Marx and other socialist writings. He soon considered himself to be a professional revolutionary, vowing to devote all his energies to overthrowing the Tsar and establishing a people's government. Since Marx's theory claimed revolution would begin in the cities, Vladimir moved to St. Petersburg in 1893. There he joined a like-minded group of revolutionaries involved in organizing worker strikes and distributing anti-government pamphlets. But in 1895, the police caught up with him. He spent 1 year in prison, followed by 3 years of exile in Siberia. Because of his wealth and education, Vladimir's time in this frozen landscape was not one of hardship. Allowed to choose where he lived, he selected a village near the Mongolian border, taking along 1,000 rubles and 100 books. This made him both the wealthiest and the most educated man in town. From his cozy rented rooms, he began a voluminous correspondence with other professional revolutionaries in Russia and across Europe. He wrote his own economic theories and translated radical works from other countries into Russian. By the time his Siberian exile ended, Vladimir was no longer an obscure revolutionary. He was gaining a European-wide reputation as a leader of the communist government. He did not return to St. Petersburg. Instead, in 1901, Vladimir went abroad, where he wandered through Europe's cities, Munich, London, and finally Geneva, meeting other Russian revolutionaries. From these places, he also wrote and edited a newspaper called Spark. Although published in Europe, the paper was smuggled into Russia in hopes of inciting workers to revolution. Afraid to use his own name, it was not uncommon for the Tsar's secret police to assassinate enemies of the state. Even when they lived outside Russia's borders, Vladimir began to write under the name Lenin. It stuck. All iron will and ambition, Lenin cared for little but politics and power. He dressed and ate simply and stuck to a precise daily schedule, allotting no time for what he considered useless leisure. Neat and orderly, he kept detailed accounts of the money he spent, shelved his books, only social and political titles alphabetically, and allotted himself exactly 15 minutes each morning to tidy his desk. This way of life, he claimed, gave him the discipline needed for revolutionary work. He would not allow himself even to listen to music. "It makes me want to do kind, stupid things and pat the heads of people," he claimed. "But now you have to beat them on the head, beat them without mercy." Lenin agreed with most of Marx's ideas, but unlike Marx, Lenin did not believe the workers could bring about a revolution on their own. Instead, a few strong leaders, drawn from the most enlightened workers and activist intellectuals, were needed to guide events and encourage armed insurrection. This, Lenin insisted, was the only way Russia could move toward communism. But many of his fellow Social Democrats disagreed. They wanted to take a more gradual approach to revolution. Immediate action to bring down the Tsarist regime wasn't necessary, they argued. Instead, they should give the workers time to discover for themselves, through the experience of labor strikes and other social struggles, the necessity of revolution. Until that time, Social Democrats should continue publishing revolutionary propaganda in an effort to educate them. Revolution, they said, would happen only when workers were ready. Lenin sneered at this idea, and in 1903, his insistence on an immediate revolt led to a split in the Social Democrat Party. From then on, SDs who followed Lenin's lead were called Bolsheviks. Those who disagreed with him were called Mensheviks, but all were communists, intent on creating in one way or another a completely free, equal, and classless society. Lenin is taken by surprise. Neither Bolshevik nor Menshevik leaders had much to do with the strikes of 1905. Their influence among the Russian workers was still too weak. In fact, news of the upheavals took Lenin completely by surprise, and yet he was in no hurry to leave Geneva for the fugitive life in Russia. As a known revolutionary leader, he would be arrested if the police found him. Instead, he tried to lead from afar, sending a stream of letters to the handful of Bolsheviks, urging them to armed insurrection. Then, Nicholas signed the October Manifesto, and Lenin grew worried. The newly granted rights, he feared, would let the pressure out of the revolutionary movement. He had to get home and rally Bolshevik Russians before their chance completely slipped away. In mid-November, just 2 weeks after the October Manifesto was declared, Lenin crossed the border and made his way to St. Petersburg. Along with a small group of Bolshevik men and women, he began planning an uprising. But could it possibly succeed? Since the manifesto, most workers were not behind them. Lenin claimed it didn't matter. "Victory?" he cried. "The point is not about victory, but about giving the regime a shake and attracting the masses to the movement." Battleground. On the morning of December 20th, the Tsar's police attempted to arrest the leaders of the Soviets, the organizations Nicholas had earlier declared illegal. This action incensed people in Moscow. Students, workers, and even well-dressed citizens surged into the streets to protest. Social Democrats, both Bolshevik and Menshevik, seized their chance and urged the people to fight against autocracy. And the people listened. Working together, they built barricades from whatever they could find: fences, overturned streetcars, telegraph poles, doors torn from nearby homes and shops. These barricades soon ringed the workers' section of the city. "The whole of Moscow has become a battleground," said one eyewitness. Homemade bombs exploded. From all directions came the sound of gunshots. Revolutionaries from St. Petersburg and other cities rushed to join in the struggle, but not Lenin. The police had picked up his trail, and the Bolshevik leader could do little but shuttle from hiding place to hiding place. Still, the events in Moscow delighted him. "Go ahead and shoot," he cried. "Summon the regiments against the Russian peasants and workers. We are for a broadening of the struggle. We are an international revolution." At Tsarskoye Selo, Nicholas chain-smoked furiously. Was this what he got from the people in return for his generous concessions? He decided to take matters firmly in hand. Deploying a special fighting unit to Moscow, he ordered them to clear the streets, using any means necessary. The Tsar's troops were ruthless. Bringing up artillery, they bombarded the workers' section until the whole district was nothing but smoldering rubble. Then soldiers entered the area. Their orders were to shoot anyone who had not already fled. Men, women, and children were systematically mowed down. By December 31st, the rebellion was over. More than 1,000 people had been killed, and thousands more were injured. And a despairing Lenin slipped away into Finland. He felt sure he'd just lost the only chance for revolution in his lifetime. Bloody Nicholas. Back at Tsarskoye Selo, Nicholas decided to crack down on all his subjects. Now, he declared, they would feel the whip. Perhaps then they would think twice before rebelling. In cities all across Russia, police arrested anyone suspected of crimes against the Tsar, imprisoning or exiling 38,000 so-called politicals and executing another 5,000. Outspoken workers lost their jobs. Their employers threatened with prison if they attempted to rehire them. Even children did not escape Nicholas's terror. Police routinely rounded up workers' children and beat them just to teach them a lesson. Things were worse in the countryside. Nicholas authorized what were known as punitive expeditions, detachments of tough, well-trained soldiers who restored order in the most brutal ways possible. Storming into a town or village, these soldiers killed citizens at random, burned entire communities without mercy, and left people wounded, homeless, and starving. "Don't skimp on the bullets," were the orders they received, and they didn't. Their work delighted Nicholas. Once, after reading a particularly gruesome report of hangings and beatings, he turned to an aide. "This really tickles me," he said. "It really does." It is estimated that between December 1905 and the start of the First Duma in April 1906, the punitive expeditions executed 15,000 people, wounded at least 20,000 more, and exiled another 45,000. One more measure was taken. In January 1906, with Nicholas's agreement, his new prime minister, Peter Stolypin, established secret courts all across the country. The purpose of these courts was to allow for the quick arrest and conviction of anyone suspected of being a political revolutionary. Over the next 2 years, the Tsar's extraordinary security, as the police were called, rounded up more than 100,000 people. Stolypin's courts sentenced most of these politicals to hard labor, prison, or exile, but at least 2,000 were executed. The hangman's noose soon became known as Stolypin's necktie. Heads bowed, workers returned to their factories, peasants to their villages. By the saber and whip, order had been restored. The lower classes no longer acted out, recalled one noble, but their courtesy, friendliness, bows were replaced by animosity and rudeness. Fear alone now kept the people in their place, and the Tsar had earned a new nickname, Bloody Nicholas. Promises made and promises broken. By the spring of 1906, Nicholas was also going back to the promises he'd made the previous October. "I'm not convinced this manifesto requires me to renounce the right of supreme power," he said. So just 1 week before the First Duma met, he decreed some new laws. He now granted himself absolute veto power over any law the Duma might try to pass, thus making his the final word on all legislation. Additionally, he gave himself the right to dissolve the Duma whenever he wanted, as well as the power to issue laws by imperial decree, when the Duma was not sitting. Last but not least, he kept complete control over foreign policy, the military, the police, and the day-to-day administration of the government. By doing so, Nicholas effectively stripped the Duma of its power before it had even convened. And yet, Nicholas still resented what he considered the Duma's interference in his government. Under no circumstances, he decided, could its members, called deputies, be trusted. The Duma opens and closes, opens and closes. On May 10, 1906, men from all walks of life, including noblemen in gold-braided uniforms, tradesmen in tailcoats, peasants in rough tunics, and workers in plain cotton blouses and coarse boots, streamed up the carved marble staircase of the Winter Palace. These were the Duma's 524 duly elected deputies, representing all 34 provinces and 3 economic classes, landowners and wealthy businessmen, townspeople, including shop owners, tradesmen, doctors, lawyers, university professors, and factory workers, and peasants. Chosen through a complicated and indirect electoral process, the vast majority of deputies were noblemen and professionals. Still, 100 peasants had found their way to the capital, as had 25 workers, and all had come to the Winter Palace for the opening ceremony of the nation's first legislature. Entering the gold and white imperial throne room, the deputies took their places on the left side of the hall. Some glared at the Tsar's ermine-draped throne and at the 4 little stools on which sat the symbols of his power, the crown, the scepter, the seal, and the orb. A regimental band began playing the national anthem. On the other side of the hall stood the Tsar's ministers, admirals, and generals, as well as members of the Romanov family. Nicholas's sisters, brothers, aunt, and uncles, even cousins. The men had come in full dress uniform, their chests glittering with medals, while the women were adorned in silk and dripping with jewels. The 2 sides stood confronting one another, recalled one eyewitness. The court dignitaries looked across in a haughty manner at the people off the street whom events had swept into the palace. One of the deputies, a tall man in a worker's blouse, scrutinized the throne and the courtiers around it with obvious disgust. As the Tsar and his entourage entered the hall, he lurched forward and stared at them with an expression of hatred. As Nicholas approached the throne, the nobility side of the hall burst into cheers, but many of the deputies remained silent. They neither crossed themselves nor bowed, but just stood with their hands in their pockets. Nicholas's sister Xenia noted with shock. Instead, they watched, stone-faced, as the Tsar mounted the dais. Pale, nervously twisting a pair of white military gloves he clutched in his hand, Nicholas began reading from a prepared speech. He said nothing about the rebellion that had forced him to create the Duma. Instead, he clung to the notion that it was all God's will. "The care for the welfare of the country entrusted to me by the Most High," he declared, "has caused me to summon representatives elected by the people to assist in the work of legislation." While Nicholas spoke, Alexander gripped her ostrich feather fan so tightly her knuckles were white. "She looked tragic," recalled one onlooker, and her face became alternately red and pale. When he finished, tears rolled down her cheeks. Nicholas, too, was overcome. As the imperial family filed from the hall, he could not hold back his emotions. "Poor Nicky was standing there in tears," exclaimed Xenia. Shaken by the sight of so many commoners in the palace, Nicholas's mother declared it a terrible ceremony. They reflected a strange hatred for us all. Nicholas's sister Olga agreed. The peasants looked sullen, but the workmen from the cities were worse. They looked as though they hated us. Just 2 days later, the Duma demonstrated its anger over the Tsar's gutting of its power by demanding he release all political prisoners. The Duma knew that granting amnesty was Nicholas's right. It also knew it could no longer enact laws without the Tsar's agreement. In other words, the deputies knew their demand was nothing more than a symbolic gesture. Their real goal was to give voice to their frustrations and perhaps force the crown to return some authority to the Duma. Nicholas fumed. How dare the deputies make such a demand? Agreeing with Xenia, who declared, "The Duma is such filth, a hearth of revolutionaries." Nicholas decided to exercise his right to dissolve it. On July 21, 1906, the doors of the Tauride Palace were locked and the Tsar's imperial decree posted. Outraged deputies could do nothing to stop this action. After just 72 days, their legislative careers were over. Nicholas did not intend to allow a second election. This denial was also his right. Prime Minister Peter Stolypin convinced him otherwise. Stolypin grasped what Nicholas could not. The government needed to appear to be working with the Duma. The Russian people saw the Tsar's signature on the October Manifesto as a sacred promise. To violate it would anger the people. Did Nicholas really want to face another rebellion? The Russian people saw the Tsar's signature on the October Manifesto as a sacred promise. To violate it would anger the people. Did Nicholas really want to face another rebellion? Reluctantly, Nicholas changed his mind. He allowed the election of a second Duma. But when the second Duma, whose makeup was similar to the first, met in February 1907, it proved just as troublesome and just as radical. Deputies publicly raged against the Tsar and demanded, among other things, that Nicholas end capital punishment, abolish government violence, and start distributing nobility-owned estates to land-hungry peasants. And so, in June 1907, just 3 months after it was convened, Nicholas dissolved the second Duma, too. "Slap, and they are gone," he told his mother. But the legislative experiment was still not over. Another election for a third Duma, complete with new deputies, was set. Why did Nicholas bother? Because it gave the impression that Russia was becoming more democratic, especially important when making trade and military alliances with leaders of Western Europe who tended to see Russia as a backward country. Still, Nicholas could not stomach another hard-to-manage Duma. At Stolypin's suggestion, he decreed a change in the voting system. Under the Tsar's new system, votes were heavily weighted by class. Now it took 230 landowners' votes to elect a single deputy, 1,000 votes for wealthy businessmen to elect a deputy, and 15,000 votes for members of the lower middle class to elect a deputy. Peasants needed 60,000 votes before they could send a representative from their class to the Duma, and workers? They needed a whopping 125,000 votes. This electoral change placed power in the hands of the nobility, wealthy landowners, and businessmen, the very type of Russian that tended to support Tsarism. Sarcastically called the Duma of the lords, priests, and lackeys, this third group of deputies, who took their seats in November 1907, was highly acceptable to Nicholas. With no reason to dissolve it, he allowed the third Duma to sit for the next 5 years. Rasputin. "We made the acquaintance of a man of God," Nicholas noted in his diary in November 1905, just weeks after signing the October Manifesto. Gregory from Tobolsk province. Gregory Rasputin began his life as a peasant farmer, but one day as he plowed the fields outside his Siberian village, he claimed to see a vision from God. Abandoning his wife and 4 children, he walked 2,000 miles to a monastery in Greece. When he returned 2 years later, he declared himself to be what Russians called a starets, a holy man. Soon he was wandering the countryside, blessing the poor and praying for the sick. By the time he arrived in St. Petersburg, he had gained a reputation as a healer and a prophet. Meanwhile, Nicholas and Alexandra had been frantically searching for a way to help their sick son. Medical specialists from across Europe had been called in. Priests had been summoned. Even a Tibetan herbalist had appeared at court. But Alexei still suffered. So when the imperial couple heard about Rasputin from cousin Militsa, they eagerly invited him to the palace. Did Nicholas and Alexandra cringe when Rasputin first appeared at Tsarskoye Selo that fall? According to some reports, the man was revolting, with his long, unwashed hair and scraggly, food-encrusted beard. Other eyewitnesses, however, contradicted this description. Rasputin was exceptionally clean, remembered his friend Alexei Filipov. He often changed his underwear, went to the baths, and never smelled bad. If the Staret's hands were soiled when he presented Alexander with gifts of holy icons and loaves of blessed bread, the royal couple surely looked past them. That's because it was the Staret's astonishing eyes people noticed first. They possessed such a strange power, many people found it hard to resist his gaze. It was at once piercing and caressing, naive and cunning, far off and intent, recalled the French ambassador Maurice Paleologue. His pupils seemed to radiate magnetism. No one knows what Rasputin and the imperial couple spoke about during their first meeting, but soon the starets began visiting the palace. He usually came after dinner, joining Nicholas and Alexandra in her lilac drawing room. After kissing 3 times in the Russian fashion, they would talk about God, miracles, and Alexei's health. Then the 3 would head upstairs to the nursery. There Rasputin led everyone, parents and children alike, into Alexei's bedroom. There was something like a hush, recalled Nicholas's sister Olga, as though we had found ourselves in church. No lamps were lit, the only light came from the candles burning in front of some beautiful icons. The children stood very still by the side of the starets, whose head was bowed. I knew he was praying. I also knew that my little nephew and nieces had joined him in prayer, added Olga. All the children were completely at ease with him. But it wasn't just conversation and prayers that kept getting Rasputin invited to the palace. It was his apparent ability to ease Alexei's pain. His Aunt Olga remembered one such incident. Arriving at the palace, she learned her little nephew was sick. She immediately went up to the nursery to look in on him. The poor child lay in pain, dark patches under his eyes and his little body all distorted, she said. The doctors were just useless, more frightened than any of us, whispering among themselves. Alexandra sent an urgent message to Rasputin in St. Petersburg. He arrived at the palace around midnight, and closing himself up in Alexei's room, stood at the end of the bed, praying. Then he laid his hand on the boy's leg. "There's a good boy," he said, his voice low and soothing. "You'll be all right." The next morning, when Olga peeked in on her nephew, she could not believe her eyes. He was not just alive, but well. He was sitting up in bed, his eyes clear and bright, not a sign of any swelling. How had Rasputin done it? To this day, no one knows. Some historians have speculated that he used his strange, piercing eyes to cast a sort of hypnotic spell over the sick and frightened boy, calming him so the bleeding slowed. Others have suggested that the starets simply had good timing, that he waited until the symptoms had run their course before appearing at Alexei's bedside to take credit for his improvement. But Alexandra believed Rasputin's healing powers were a gift from God, the answer to all her long hours of prayer. Here at last, she told herself, was the man whose coming Dr. Felipe had foretold 2 years earlier, the man who will speak to you of God.